I'm Brian Jones, and I'm here to talk about backcountry safety today. Thanks a lot for coming out. I just wanted to start off with just a couple of questions. The people in the crowd here, how many of you guys have heard of the North Shore Search and Rescue? Great, I'm glad. That's a good start. That's a good start. So at least I know where you guys are all coming from. For those of you that haven't heard of the North Shore Search and Rescue and many of the other search and rescue teams, there's quite a few in the region. I just use those ones because they happen to be in the news a lot, but there's Ridge Meadows, there's Lions Bay, there's Squamish, there's Whistler, Beaverton. All of the search and rescue teams in this whole part of our world that we like to play, they've been working overtime. And one of the things that I really want to do is help them get some more time off. They're all volunteers. And everything I'm talking about here ultimately is to try and keep those guys and gals at home at night and not out looking for folks like us that are out playing in the mountains. We're out there to have fun and not get lost and not get rescued. On that note, can you guys all hear me back there? I can't tell if I'm yelling or a little bit louder maybe. Okay, there we go. I'll come in a little bit closer. Just wanted to start off a little bit about backcountry safety and myself. I've been going into the mountains since I was quite young, just a little kid, and I kind of learned by the school of hard knocks, so to speak. I would just go out and do stuff, had nobody to mentor me, nobody to lead me, nobody to teach me the right way of doing things and the wrong way of doing things. So inevitably I did a lot of stuff the wrong way. I spent a lot of time in the mountains going out in cotton shirts, and no extra gear, and shorts, and shoes that didn't fit, and getting blisters, and I survived. But I also went on to become a mountain guide. That's what I do as a profession, and I take people into the mountains and I try to keep them safe. I've had a few experiences where I've definitely been making some mistakes, and I've come out and I've tried to learn from them, and I've reflected back. And some of the biggest epic stories that I've had, and I'm not going to bore you guys with the stories. You're welcome to come over to my booth later and chat with me, but I've had some great stories. I've been stuck out for days on end, not sure exactly how I was going to get myself out of various predicaments. But inevitably what they came back to was poor communication and poor planning. And I found that that's kind of been the focus. I see so many of my own mistakes and so many other people's. It comes back to poor communication, poor planning. So I'm going to hopefully share with you guys some stuff about planning today and give you some insights. I'm sure a lot of it will be a refresher, and hopefully some of it will be new. Make sure I got all my technical stuff going here. There we go. So I'd kind of like to get a show of hands here. What sort of group do we have out here in terms of like hikers? Put your hand up if you like hiking. Excellent. That's good stuff. Trail runners. Got any trail runners out there? Excellent. It's becoming more and more popular. How about snowshoeing? Yeah, got a bunch of snowshoers. Good to see. Good to see. Scrambling. Oh, a few folks doing some scrambling there. It's kind of like not mountaineering, not climbing, not hiking. It kind of blends it all together. If you haven't gone, if you're a hiker, you'll probably want to get into scrambling someday. How about just full on outright climbing, getting the ropes out, getting the climbing shoes? Any climbers in the crowd? Got a few. And any hunters, fishermen? People get out and recreate that way? Absolutely. Just as many hazards out there, doesn't matter what you're doing. A little bit of something showing up on my screen here. What about skiers? Any backcountry skiers? Everybody get outside of bounds there? Yeah, a little bit of that too. That's great. So lots of different ways of getting out and recreating in the mountains. And again, obviously we want to keep them all as safe as possible. So just curious on the same note here, let's just see a show of hands. Has anybody experienced getting lost? Like I'll put my hand up there. I've been lost before. It's not a pleasant feeling. I've been lost in the parking lots. It's easy to get lost. You don't have to go into the mountains to get lost. What about getting caught out after dark? Anybody done that trip where I know I'm going to get back and don't? Okay, hopefully you had headlamps. You're all here, so it couldn't have been that bad. And anybody here ever needed a rescue? Anybody ever had to call out for a rescue? I see a couple of hands out there. Yeah, it sure is nice to know that there are some resources out there we can call on when we need them. Anybody injured yourself? Anybody ever had a bad crash on their bike or whatever it is? Yeah, a few out there for sure. Breaking gear. We all know about gear. Doesn't matter how much money you spend on it, it's going to fall apart at some point. Really bad weather. You go out and you think it's going to be nice. Fans are going up. Yeah. It's kind of a common refrain here. How about animals? You ever had any scary encounters? Yeah. You know, I'm watching these hands going up and I'm thinking, any one of you could be up here telling the stories. I mean, there's a lot of stories out there, a lot of experience in this crowd. I mean, every single one of these questions, whether it's animals getting caught out overnight, something's happened to somebody here. So it just shows you how much is going on in our woods, and you're all coming back, which is great. Glad to see that. So what I'd like to talk about today is knowing our hazards. We can identify our hazards. That's going to help us avoid them. How to plan. You know, what do we want to do to make sure that we go out as many times as possible without running into problems? What to bring? You know, what sort of stuff do we want to bring? And staying found. That's what I refer to as navigation. We always want to stay found. If you always stay found, you'll never get lost. And who to call if anything does go wrong. We all know who North Shore Search and Rescue is, but how are you going to get hold of them if you're out there? Animal safety. And just general hiking tips, and I'd love to answer as many questions as might come up here. So, common hazards. When I think of common hazards, I try to break them into a couple of different categories. So we've got objective hazards and subjective hazards. Does anybody out there know what the difference might be? Just take a stab. Like, what's an objective hazard? I'm not sure if anybody answers, if I can even hear you or not. But an objective hazard basically is something that we don't have a lot of control over. So if you start thinking of objective hazards, it's stuff like animals. You know, we're just minding our own business, taking all our precautions, and all of a sudden, you know, there's, you know, a rat in our food. I mean, that's an objective hazard. We can't do much about it. Weather is an objective hazard. We cannot control the weather. We cannot control rockfall, avalanches, tides, currents. If you're out in the ocean at all, wildfires. I'm sure you guys can kind of start thinking about this. This is all things we have no control over. Flip side of that is subjective hazards. Inexperience. That's a real classic subjective hazard. This is something that we have control over. We can choose to go out with no experience, or we can choose to go out with a lot of experience. We can get lost. I mean, that's something we have control over. Fatigue, blisters, medical conditions like that. Improper equipment. Caught out after dark, we talked about that briefly. Poor communication, lots of stuff like that, and more. So the subjective hazards are really the ones we want to focus on, because that's what we have full control over. Okay, if we get lost, we only have ourselves to blame. We can't blame some animal for chasing us off the trail and forcing us to get lost. So this is from a first aid course, just so you know, this isn't real. I think it's actually my son in there. And you look at that though, and you think of the worst case scenarios, and none of us ever wants to have to deal with packaging somebody up in the wilderness and doing first aid and calling for the search and rescue. We don't want to do that. And if you look at a picture like this, you see a blister on a foot. And you think, oh yeah, who here's had blisters? Yeah, just about everybody here. If you hike, you've had blisters. So you don't really think too much about blisters. But if I think of those two scenarios, I've been going into the mountains for 40 plus years. I've never had to package anybody up fully with spinal and do all that sort of stuff and evacuate them. I've had to treat countless blisters, and I've had to turn full trips around. I've had to cancel expeditions because of blisters. So I kind of put this in this idea of this kind of perceived risk, real risk. We all go out worried about the worst possible outcomes, you know, crashing and burning and ending up in a stretcher and getting airlifted off the mountain, when often it's the little things like this that start the chain of events that can lead to big incidents. So don't ignore those blisters. Just a little thing about risk here, probability consequence. Not going to spend too much time on this, it's fairly straightforward stuff. If we have a high probability, a low consequence event, it's really not a high hazard. So a day hike up in Lynn Valley with a forecast of rain showers, there's a good probability you're going to get wet, but the consequences are pretty minimal. We're not really worried about that. Conversely, if we have a high probability, high consequence, so a day hike to the Lions with a forecast for electrical storms, that might be a little bit different. The consequences there are much higher. So whenever I'm going out in the hills, and part of my planning process is I have to figure out what are my hazards for this day, for this hike, for this ski trip, this bike trip, whatever it is I'm doing, and ask myself, what are the consequences if something goes wrong here? So planning is risk reduction. So the more planning we can do, the lower our risk will be, the higher our fun factor. We all want a good fun factor when we're going out there. So what can we do? Well, we plan as well as possible. And this is everything. This is our emergency planning, this is our communication, this is our food, this is our logistics, this is even down to the point of who are you going out with. You all know who you hike with. And there's certain hikes you probably go on with some people, but you wouldn't take other people. It's just, kind of common sense. And if you take that same theme into all of your hiking, tell somebody where you're going. That's kind of the main focus of your plan, is that somebody else knows. That's critical. Hazard evaluation. We want to know what all of our hazards are. So I went through subjective, objective. Just look at your hike, look at your activity, whatever it is you're doing, plan it out, and develop an action plan. And then recognize all those hazards and avoid them. If you can recognize them and avoid them, you're going to go a long ways towards having an incident-free time in the mountains. And knowing your abilities, I think that's kind of key. Stay within your limits. A lot of this sort of stuff comes back to, if you look at the incidents and the reports that have come out of the North Shore Search and Rescue and the Whistler and Ridge Meadows and Chilliwack, all of these search and rescue teams out there that are working, they come back and they see time and again people that underestimate their abilities, people that don't tell folks where they're going, people that don't plan ahead and don't really think things through. They don't understand their hazards. How many times have you been out on a hike and you see people completely unprepared? And this is the sort of thing, is we don't want to be those people. We don't want to be one of those people. So 10 essentials. You can't have a talk like this without the 10 essentials. So what are the 10 essentials? And I think we probably know this, but maybe not. So, and there might even be more. I think there's various different 10 essentials lists out there. So right off the bat, I want to have a map. I want to know where I'm going. Anytime I'm in the backcountry, I want to know exactly where I'm going. I want to know a compass. Have a compass and know how to use that compass. So it's no use having the map and compass if you're not familiar using it. Some form of a knife, a small, sharp implement of some sorts. Matches and candle. So if you are stuck out overnight, you can actually get a fire going. Extra food and water. Many people go out just thinking, it's only going to be a 3-hour tour, the proverbial 3-hour tour, and days later they're rescued. You want to go out, if you're only going out for 3 hours, take more than you need for 3 hours. So extra clothing. Same, you guys all have seen the weather around here and how quickly it can change. Some form of a light, and it can just be a small pen light. I know some people will say, well, what about my phones? I've got a light on my phone. Yeah, possibly. First aid supplies and a signal device. So a signaling device can be a phone, but we all know the downsides of the phones are if the battery dies, it's done. And honestly, if I'm relying on a phone, I don't want to be using it for my flashlight and burn up my battery just because I want to read the book to keep myself from getting bored, and then I no longer have a communications device. So this is one of the reasons I don't like using phones as flashlights. And the last one, of course, is some form of a shelter. So this is what we refer to as the 10 essentials. And all of this, if you get quite creative, you can actually get every single one of these into a small, little, tiny day pack, or even into a fanny pack. It doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be expensive. It's actually quite straightforward to get this stuff. So you may be looking at trips that you want to throw some other gear into, and that might just be based on your activity. It might be winter time. So on winter ski tours, snowshoeing tours, longer trips into the mountains, I might throw in a stove and fuel. If I know it's a real cold environment and I'm up above tree line, or maybe you're in the coast where it's been pouring rain for 6 months, you know you can't get a fire going, throw in a stove and a fuel. You can get some very, very small, lightweight stoves. Whether they're a pressurized gas or a liquid gas or a kerosene stove. Some form of a repair kit. So depending on the gear you have, if you're out snowshoeing, ski touring, maybe you're paddling, lots of different activities that are fairly gear intensive, bring a repair kit. So if you break your gear, it's not going to be the cause of you being stuck out overnight. If you are stuck out overnight, especially in the winter, having some form of a sit pad, an insulating pad, to keep you off the snow is quite important. And that could just be sitting in the back of your pack. It's really nice for lunches too. A small saw, that's another thing you can throw in. There's very, very small saws. There's probably guys down at the other end of the show here selling this sort of stuff. great pieces of equipment like that. And then the last one too, from a navigation perspective, is GPSs are becoming more and more popular. And if you get a GPS, you'll find that the key thing is knowing how to use it. Every time I get a different GPS app on my phone, there goes a day, at least, for me trying to figure out how to use the new one. So spend some time. Don't just get your GPS, say, hey, I've got a GPS on my new phone, and wait till you're lost, because chances are it's not going to be that intuitive. These things actually take a little bit of work. Talk now a little bit about, okay, say you get lost, you do want to call out, you get hold of search and rescue. It's nice to have a bigger picture of what's going on with search and rescue. So a couple of folks here have mentioned that they either know search and rescue or have been involved with rescues before. But search and rescue in BC, if you do call out, there's a few different levels. So if it's an air, it's the Canadian Armed Forces. If it's the Marine, it's the Coast Guard. So by air is if it's a plane crash or a helicopter crash you're involved in, that's who's going to come and get you. It's going to be the Air Force, the Canadian Forces. For most of our activities that we're doing, from what I was hearing everybody saying here, we're going to be contacted by the ground search and rescue, and that is all done with volunteer search and rescue teams, and it's all administered through the RCMP. So every single call out, if you do call out for search and rescue, you don't call the search and rescue team. So if you do have the phone, you don't say, oh, I would like, get me the listing for North Shore Search and Rescue. You call RCMP, they coordinate all of the search and rescues. So the standard number is your 911 if you're in 911 service area, but be aware there are a lot of places that you might be accessing. You may not have 911. So if you're way out past Pemberton, up the Duffy Lake Road, doing a hike or a snowshoe up in the Joffrey Lakes, and you want to contact the Pemberton RCMP, you would need the Pemberton RCMP phone number, or the Whistler RCMP phone number, or Lillooet, or whatever region you're in. So make sure that you get those numbers. That's part of your planning. And ultimately, it all goes through Victoria, but that doesn't really make much difference to us. If for some reason you just have a pure medical evacuation, you can actually go straight to the BC Air Ambulance Service. And just like calling an ambulance into downtown Vancouver, you can call an air ambulance, given a lot of different criteria. So you can contact them and request it. They may actually turn it into a search and rescue, even if it's not a full-blown search and rescue. It's just a medical emergency. So just nice to be aware, and again, research that before you go into your activities. And then speaking of all of this, how do we communicate? How do we get to the outside? There's so many different devices out there. Again, back to planning. I don't know if anybody here has ever done any hiking or snowshoeing up on Seymour. Has anybody, you ever tried to use your phone up there? Yeah? How well does it work? Yeah? Okay. I've found actually there's a lot of places on Seymour I just cannot get out. Maybe I've just got the wrong wrong service provider. But there's a lot of areas where you might think you can get coverage, but you can't get coverage. Even inside of Vancouver, you can see Vancouver, zero bars. So don't rely on a phone just because you're close. There are other alternatives. There's sat phones, there's InReach devices. These are brands. Spot is another brand. They're emergency beacons, and that's certainly worth thinking about if you're going into areas without cell coverage. And it's a great peace of mind for people that are behind when you leave them your plan that you're going out and you tell them I have a device that I can activate if I do get lost or if I get injured. So certainly worth doing the research. I've used all of them and consistently use all of them for different programs. If anybody's interested in this stuff, pop over to our booth, Canada West Mountain School, after this, and I'm happy to chat with you guys about that. And then a few things to keep in mind. Cell phones, they're the most common. Everybody's got a cell phone, but they're also in many ways the least reliable because the batteries die, they don't work when it's cold, you drop them in the water or get them wet in rain, they're done. If you spend too much time out, if you are stuck out overnight, they may not last the night. In the critical moments when the search and rescue team is out there at first light and they want to know where you are and they might ask you for identifying landmarks, your phone's dead. So sat phones, far more reliable. You can use them, depending on the sat phone, almost anywhere in the world. Radios are generally line of sight, but if you're going into an area where you know maybe there's a logging operation or a fishing village or some heli-ski operation or something in the mountains where they have radios, you can use those. And that's the Spot, those are the beacons, the emergency beacons are the other ones then. And then just good old-fashioned signaling devices. Make a fire, Get a mirror and reflect some light. I mean, whistles. If you're hunting and you've got a gun, light off some shots. I mean, there's all sorts of different ways of signaling people that you don't require the modern high-tech stuff. Don't lose track of that. Don't think, oh, my radio died, I can do nothing. There's lots of alternatives still. There's been all sorts of stories of people being found because they've tramped out in the snow, SOS, or they've used sticks, or they've started fires. I mean, we've been doing it for thousands of years, and it still works. So just to avoid getting lost, we stay found. Has anybody heard that term before, staying found? Yeah, a few people nodding their heads, a few people shaking their heads. Remember that. Just tell yourself every time you go on your next trip, I am going to stay found all day. And at any point during the day, you should know where you are. If you don't know where you are, you're getting close to being lost, because at that point, if the clouds come in, you're not going to be able to figure out which way is which and how to get home, perhaps. So I think the key thing with staying found is I try to do as much research as possible. I spent a lot of time going into areas I've never been into before, and I'll spend hours and hours poring over my maps before I go into an area, so I'm really familiar with looking at Google Earth. There's some great online resources, Google Earth being one of them. I think it's probably one of the best. And so maps, compasses, all the tools. I've got an altimeter right here. It tells me my elevation above sea level. I know how to use these. And I think that's kind of the key thing too. And if you do get misplaced, temporarily misplaced, if you don't know where you are, you haven't stayed found, you want to, and you truly feeling like, okay, I'm going to get lost. If I go farther, I'm going to get myself into some form of harm, whether it's going over a cliff or into an avalanche terrain or down a creek where I don't want to go. Excuse me. Stay put and make yourself visible. So high ground is the best. Most people on the North Shore Mountains try to go down, and that's the worst thing they can do. If anything, go high, because the higher you go, you're going to ultimately reach a point where there's you're more visible. You're on a ridge top, you'll see more, and maybe you can actually see a way out. If you go down, you see less, and people are going to have a much harder time finding you. The trees get bigger. You've got the tree canopy above you. There's no way that the helicopters and the people searching for you are going to find you. So be visible, stay high. And the route finding, when you're going out, it's your choice. Again, this is a subjective. You can choose to make a very complicated route, or you can choose to keep it simple. So if you're going somewhere where it's well signed and well documented, lots of research and lots of trail reports and lots of people going there, you're far less likely to get into trouble. Whereas if you start going into areas where there's no information on the internet, there's no guidebooks, and there's no trail markers, that's going to be way more complicated. So your skill set, your experience should be much higher to tackle that. So just baby steps. Start off with the trails that are well marked, lots of information. Go to the parks, have the parks people, the park staff can advise you where to go, and then build from there. Get the experience, and choose the appropriate weather, because navigation, it's way easier to stay find on a clear blue sky day than it is on a day like today or yesterday. And then again, just to leave you with that, stay found, always know where you are. Animals. I think everybody raised their hand when we talked about animals here. Anybody ever really had a bad experience with an animal here? Anybody scared of going into the mountains or into the backcountry because of bears or cougars? Has anybody chosen to not go into the mountains sometimes because they're worried about bears and cougars? It's a legitimate concern. It's a very legitimate concern. People do get hurt, but the percentage is very low, and with a bit of proper planning, you can actually make it very minimal. So a few things is, again, back to understanding, what are the real risks? Most of our risks are just coming from rodents. And then there are large animals, but they're not just the bears and the cougars. So just be aware of all the other animals out there and know their habits. So find out, where they would travel and when they would travel. So bears at this time of year are not an issue, but bears on a spawning channel in late September at the mouth of the river, you might want to give that hike a pass. If you see the salmon are all spawning, then the bears are going to be down there. In the big blueberry patches, August and September, and sometimes into October when the blueberries are really ripe, the bears are out there, and that's where they're going to be feeding. Just don't do those hikes, avoid them. So if you get to know where it is that the animals are, the best thing we can do is avoid them. These are not predatory animals. The vast majority of animals that we have encounters with, they are not out there hunting us. They want to stay away from us. So the best thing we can do is just avoid them. And if you do happen to go into areas of the world, but I know if you do travel where there are polar bears, that you might want to take a different approach there. But yeah, that's the big thing there. And the number one rule, if you're worried about bears, is don't have something that they do want. They don't want us, they want our food. So if we have really good habits around our campsites, then they won't come and bother us. If we leave our food out, they're going to come visit. You're going to have an unwanted dinner guest for sure. So a few things about food storage, that's the key factor, is you want some sort of a bear-proof container. If you're going into bear country, you're doing multi-day trips, get a bear-proof container. And then a food hang. If you have big trees, you got to hang it high. You have to know how to do it. This is a skill. It's not, I mean, you might be able to just kind of wing it and figure it out, but it is actually a fairly legitimate skill to actually put up a good food hang with a lot of food. It's not easy. And a lot of times if you're up in the alpine or the subalpine around here, the trees are really small. You spend 2 hours trying to get your food up and it's this high off the ground, right at mouth level for a bear. It's like you just helped them. So you really have to be careful about that. And that's where they've designed the bear canisters are the best. If you have large groups, if you go with a big group, consider multiple food hangs. I've seen a lot of people where they'll have 10 people's worth of food and it weighs like 50 kilos worth of food and they're trying to hoist it up. Don't bother, it's not going to work. You got to have maybe 5 kilos is a heavy food bag. So you break it down into a bunch of bags. It's a good idea. And not just food, think about all scented items. So your toothpaste, your any clothes that have been smeared with food, you might want to keep them, all your dishes, anything that's, if you're out fishing and you've been cleaning the fish, well, you don't want to be leaving the fish guts right next to your tent, but then you store your food way off in the tree. Those are all the sorts of things you want to think about. Standard protocol is that you want to be at least 25 meters away, and that's same with cooking. So if you're doing an overnight trip, you cook, you store all your food, you leave all your cooking utensils, and then you go back into your tent. If I'm in an area that I know is a lot of bears, I might even consider having a certain set of clothes that I'll cook and eat with, and then when I go to bed, I'll leave those clothes in my food hang, and I won't take them into my tent with me. Because the main thing is you don't want your tent to smell like a snack. So what if? So if a bear does show some sort of aggressive behavior, just back away. Again, they don't really want a confrontation any more than we do. And larger groups have been shown to keep bears away. There's certain parks and national parks in the Rockies that you can't go into at certain times of year unless you've got a group of 4 people. And it's just research has shown that a group of 4 people is far less likely to be attacked by a grizzly bear than 3, 2, or 1. So they make it mandatory, certain trail closures at certain times of year, all of a sudden you'll show up. You cannot hike this trail unless you're a group of 4. But if you're a group of 4, it's fine. The bears will leave you alone. And if you happen to come across any sign of food from a bear actively eating, just leave. That's avoidance. Recognition and avoidance. It all comes back down to so many of our hazards. Recognize the hazards and avoid them. And a lot of people ask about pepper spray, bear spray. Last resort. You really don't want to come around the corner, see a bear who's rooting around in a blueberry bush, who's startled, and then pepper spray it. Because now you might have a bit of a different story on your hand. Before he was just a little upset that you interrupted his blueberry feast. Now he's really mad. So do not use it. Absolutely do not use it unless you know that the last chance before that bear is on top of you, which is pretty rare. It's very, very rare that these bear attacks happen. Just have a few little hiking tips here too, just to toss in. Always let somebody know where you're going. I think is one of the key ones. We can't reinforce that too much. Check the weather forecasts. Mountain weather changes dramatically. Also get to know the weather patterns. Stay hydrated, stay well fed, because we don't make good decisions when we're all kind of, haven't had our Snickers bar or whatever your favorite nutrition snack is halfway through the day. So keep that blood sugar level up, and that's also for the sake of your hiking partners too. And know your limits. Choose your objectives.